Ryan, can I share my screen?
Yeah, let me make sure that you're selected properly. Okay.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody, for the second community listening session of the Mayor's Pledge Work Group. We're delighted to have you here. My name is Nicole Hendricks, and I am the facilitator for this evening's listening session. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in sharing your insights on public safety and policing in Easthampton. It's important that we hear from the many voices that make up the Easthampton community. So we've scheduled 2 hours for this session and we'll end no later than 8 p.m. Before I provide you with the context for today's session, I want to introduce the members of the Mayor's Pledge Work Group. So I'll just say their names and maybe folks can give a wave. It's Rebecca Pasa, Margaret Kirstein, Omar Gomez, and Alice Wanamaker. It's great to have all of you here. And they're a volunteer group. I just wanted to make a note of that. And they've been doing this work in service of the Easthampton community, and we really thank them for those efforts. The purpose of this community listening session is to hear directly from community members. We want to learn more about this evening visions for public safety. And so I'm smiling because this means we get to be a little creative tonight. To give you some context about our last session, we were more focused on experiences with the police and current policing perspectives. And so this evening, our goal is to do some imagining and visioning for the future. So that's pretty exciting. At the end of today's session, we'll have learned more about your experiences, your ideas, what you love, what you need to be safe in Easthampton, and maybe what you might want to change. And this isn't to say that this particular Mayor's Pledge work group is going to solve all of the community concerns that are addressed today. This information, and I said this in our last session, will be summarized and used to inform the efforts that are being undertaken by community leaders, local organizations, activists, elected officials, residents, to build systems and responses that recognize the humanity and the dignity of every person in the Easthampton community. So we'll spend the majority of the session talking about public safety, and just please bear with me for a minute while I give a quick overview of the charge. This is the charge that Mayor LaChapelle gave this group when she signed the Mayor's Pledge. And it is through rigorous and holistic outreach, the work group will review the Easthampton Police Department's use of force policies and offer recommendations for reform in a final report to be submitted to the mayor. So it is a narrow lens and a narrow focus, but we do hope that this work is part of a larger set of activities and movements within your community. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is just Zoom and how we'll be using it this evening. In an ideal, obviously, different world than the COVID world we're in, we would be really engaging in this dialogue in person. And so tonight, in order to try to hear multiple voices and to hear from people who might not feel comfortable speaking up and using their speaking voice, you can also use the chat. But if you would like to speak, we're asking that you raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking on this participant button And then it should give you an option under reactions to raise your hand. You can also use the chat. And so if you have comments or things you'd like to say, you can do so in the chat. Our wonderful Omar Gomez will be monitoring the chat and helping us. And he'll also be putting some links in the chat. So in addition to this session, we wanted to make sure people are aware that after tonight's session, we are accepting private testimony from folks. If you would like to email us, you can use the Mayor's Pledge Workgroup email, which is right here. It's the mpwg@easthamptonmass.gov. You can also go to the city website, and maybe Omar will put a link in the chat, and there's a link for a short survey. It's very, very short. And so we really welcome your feedback in that format as well. Finally, if there are groups or people who would like to schedule a private listening session, we encourage you to do so. And you can reach us at the same email address. So I want to give just an overview of how we'll go about the session and a sort of shared understanding of the content and flow. And I'm showing you a set of guiding questions that will be the focus of our listening for this evening. It's in the title, it's a listening session. So we really hope to do very little talking after this. We want to hear from you, but we want to give you some guideposts in terms of the feedback that we're seeking this evening. So we'll be asking for your opinions and ideas. It's my job as the facilitator to guide the conversation. And we're asking for your candid responses. I think it's also important to kind of share this distinction that came up in the last community listening session about the difference between police and individual police officers and policing as an institution. Policing as an institution has always regulated movement and access to resources and enforced some boundaries of belonging, whether that's in a neighborhood, in a country, or even in a category like being a woman. And so the legacy of this is something that the Mayor's Pledge work group holds at the center of this work. And so we ask these questions tonight, sort of drawing that difference between people who do the work of policing and policing as an institution. So these are the questions we'd like to talk a bit about. The first is, imagine your ideal community. What does it look like? Who's in it? How does it feel? How do people get what they need? How do they keep each other safe? And how does this ideal community respond to harm? If there are police in your imagination, what are they doing? How do they fit into this sort of ideal community? So sort of put another way, what kind of policing does a city like Easthampton need? And so I'm gonna say one last thing and then we'll open it up for conversation. Just to remind folks, you're under no obligation to speak. If you're here to just listen, that's great. One person will be invited to speak at a time. Please raise your hand. And you will have 3 minutes to offer your input. So please try to be concise and use concrete examples. If there's time, we will, certainly extend that. The final thing is, when you do speak, anything you say is going to be in aggregate in our report. What you say, obviously this is being streamed on Easthampton Media. So what you say right now is public. But in terms of the final report, that we will be submitting to the mayor, we are not planning to identify anyone specifically. And we will be, keeping comments that are included in the survey and certainly in emails to us, those will be confidential and anonymous. That was a lot. Any questions about all of that before we open it up to listen to folks? Okay. So let me stop sharing this here because Omar has put our questions in the chat. Thank you, Omar. If you would like to jump on in and comment, we'll look for you to raise your hand if you are able to do so. Hi, Ellen. Go ahead.
Hi, I guess I'll jump in. I'm a relatively new resident. I moved in with my husband in the fall of 2019. So I'm still trying to figure out how Easthampton works. I'm in precinct 2. Hello, Mr. Gomez. I'm glad you represent me. I voted for you, although I had not met you. Now I will know better. I mean, I will still vote for you. What do I imagine? I'm just coming off this huge thing my church did, multi-part visioning about diversity and anti-racism. I have to say, I don't know. I can't draw something about the future of the community I want to live in. It always looks like a Hallmark card or something that really wonderful little kindergarten kids draw with stick figures. So my best shot of it is it would be really amazing if, and I say this as a new person, if you moved into Easthampton, you knew that you were joining something. That, being in Easthampton meant that you were a part of something and not just having an address in Easthampton. I don't know how you do that. I want to say I'm not that big a newbie. I've lived in the Valley my whole life. I spent my high school time driving over the hill from Holyoke to sit on the concrete at Donatuck Park Pool, seeing if there were any boys that we hadn't met yet from another town. So I've been in the area my whole life, but Easthampton is new to me. And I'm impressed in many ways. I'm very impressed, especially by the kind of things like this that are going on. And I'm sorry that there are only 12 people here. That's it.
Thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate what you said, especially about how challenging it can be to reimagine or vision or think of an ideal community, because we are so often stuck among the boundaries of what we think is possible. And maybe that Hallmark card, I don't know, I'd love to hear what that looks like for you, because that's sort of this creative moment. It may be letting go of some of those constraints that we think make things impossible is how we move towards a more inclusive community that makes you feel like you're joining something. But I appreciate what you've said. And thank you for getting us started. Anything that folks would like to add to that or to follow up on? And it can be related to any of the questions that we've raised, or maybe we're not asking the right questions. Maybe you have a question that you would like to ask and answer. How would a community keep folks safe if policing isn't necessarily the only way? Lindsay, are you? Go ahead, Lindsay.
Hello, I'm Lindsay. I think this is such a fun question because, like Ellen, I mean, I moved here 10 years ago, but we had to come into a new community. And I think overall Easthampton's very safe. Like, I don't think there's a lot of crime. Um, and so I just feel like with community safety, there's always been such an emphasis on law enforcement, and it sounds so punitive. And I know that I know that the police in our community spend a lot of their time just helping folks out, like a lot of drug overdose. They help with drug overdose. They help with domestic disputes. They help a lot of mental health crises. A lot of their work. I mean, I guess you'll have the data, so I'll be interested to see it. But I feel like probably the majority of the work is helping folks out, not like enforcing people breaking the law. So with that in mind, I'm just wondering, like, if we can just be really creative, like it would be so great to have a community safety force that was like equal police, equal mental health workers, equal drug intervention folks, all working together in collaboration. Because I know the police, because of defunding of mental health services, they're asked to do a lot of things that they don't have intense training for, and it's not really their role. But that is things we need in our community to keep us safe. So I think it would be really cool if instead of it being so divided, there was like a community safety, if we're just being creative, community safety division, and there was a high up person there with social work degree, running those types of folks, mental health intervention people, crisis intervention, drug intervention, even domestic disputes. A lot of times, if there's a domestic violence situation, it might be better to have a social worker, both social worker show up with a police officer, because both those needs are there at that. So I'd really love to have a more holistic, integrated community safety force in Easthampton. That's my creative envisioning.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, I like some of the words you've said, or they're compelling, and they're part of some of the comments we've heard from folks who have given feedback in other forums. Integrative, there has been quite a bit of conversation about responding to mental health crises, and that's true at the national level. There's a real push to re-envision how we move some of that away from the responsibilities of police, because it didn't necessarily exist there to begin with. It's sort of the result of what you've mentioned, deinstitutionalization and a lack of funding for responding to mental health challenges. So I think that is a theme that we are hearing. So I hear sort of some kind of more integrated community safety that provides resources that are non-punitive, but still keeping some kind of collaboration. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's what I was saying, like collaboration. Yeah. There was something, I lost my other thought, but I'll let you know when it comes back.
Okay. Tom.
Hey, I'm mostly here just to listen, but what Lindsay said kind of reminded me of a thought I had the other day, which is that sort of, it's not just the police. We basically, I think in a lot of ways, because of the way that that city finances got sort of restructured in the later half of the 20th century, a lot of it was really structured to shrink government, and to put governments in I could go on about that, but I guess the point is, like, we basically have a situation where new or evolving sort of problems come up, or where we gain a different understanding of problems. And the thought is never to bring in new resources. It's always to take the people who are currently there and give them more work. I think the first time that really crystallized with me was talking to some very frustrated teachers. But over the course of this, I realized that I think police sometimes might find themselves in the same shoes, where, new problems emerge, and we don't really, like, our way to address them is to take the people who are currently there and give them a broader portfolio of things to do, and not necessarily the the resources to do those things. So, you know, in that light, you know, if you could find the funds, I definitely would be interested in seeing like what could be done to, you know, bring in, like to look at the calls that the police are responding to, and try and identify like what are things that maybe these aren't maybe these aren't the skills that are best suited to addressing this sort of situation, and maybe there's a different set of skills that could be helpful and would leave everyone just feeling better about. I mean, I don't think that necessarily the police are just, you know, chomping at the bit to go out and handle mental health calls to begin with. So I mean, I don't know. It's just sort of, I agree with what Lindsay's saying. I think that there's some stuff there that is potentially interesting.
Thank you, Tom. Ellen, is that a hand?
It is a hand. My reactions screen on Zoom doesn't give me anything except a thumbs up, which I'll do that if I, just kind of, I have a fairly unique experience for a civilian in that I came out of the human services, family planning, birth control clinic world and spent 2 years, it's now 15 years ago, in about 2006, 2007, working for the district attorney's office, doing a safety audit about the court procedures, safeguarding domestic violence victims. And so I've read hundreds of police reports and hundreds of case record files about domestic violence. And I've been so pondering this question since the defund police started. And I'm just going to say this. There is, to my knowledge, which could be old, there is currently a domestic violence intervention program called a DVIP, in which every police officer in Franklin and Hampshire counties can call upon an on-call domestic violence advocate employed by one of the local shelters to be available by phone to a victim at any moment, day or night. That in my experience, in the crisis of the moment, that's usually the last thing that the victim wants to spend time with. That the concept that there would be an actual advocate who would walk in the door in those situations is dangerous. Those women do not want their license plates being noticed by a potentially violent person. They don't want their face being recognized by a potentially violent person. I have really struggled personally to try to figure out what we can do. A bunch of people in my book group are mental health professionals. Some of them have been on crisis intervention teams. We talked about the mental health interventions arriving on the scene instead of a police officer. They don't know if what you do is you arrive and you call for backup if it's violent, or do you arrive with the police officer? I've been following A Knee Is Not Enough on Facebook, the local Easthampton folks. They posted a Newton police fatality. The police killed someone in Newton in the last month in response to a mental health call. There was a mental health clinician at the scene. They stayed away from the call. They did not arrive. They did not go in with the police force because the person having the mental health issue was armed with a knife. I think it was wrong that they fired guns and shot and killed this person, but it's true that the mental health person, by newspaper reports, stayed out because it was too dangerous for them to go in. So this is so not easy. And, you know, I have had this, in the last week, I've had this horrible sensation because it seems so possible that this is true in America, that this 24/7 police response to crisis is the cheapest way to go at this. I mean, because it could be a lot more expensive to pay for 24/7 mental health interventions that would cover, what, 5, 6 simultaneous calls in Franklin and Hampshire counties at all moments of the day and night, which is what the police does. And it sounds, there's some truth to it rings true in my head that maybe this response, which is not good right now, is cheap compared to other responses. Despite what we say about, police budgets and all that stuff. So that's me.
Ellen, thank you so much for sharing. That's a lot to unpack. What comes to mind, I don't have much to add, but I would say is when we say cheap, you're right, as far as the level of response and the 24-hour response, it
Mhm.
may be less expensive, but maybe we also are hoping to think about the costs and the outcomes. And so when we think about whether it's cheap or not, right? What are we getting, right? What are the outcomes? Do we succeed in repairing that harm or connecting people up with the kinds of treatment and services that they need after those events? What happens to the person who's committed the harm? Do they stop committing that harm because they're now incarcerated potentially? I mean, these are when we think about, visioning, I guess that's where I would go is, I think your description is a good one, that maybe that's the default, but if we're envisioning a different world, what would that look like? How would we respond to those harms in a way that doesn't perpetuate the cycles that I think you're describing? Because I think the current system doesn't necessarily succeed in when we intervene using law enforcement. I guess this is the question. Do we succeed in preventing further violence in families?
I just want to say that at the point where I was doing this work, there was no treatment that batterers could enter that was securely proven to have any impact. There was no way to make a woman, there's no way to save a woman from murder by treating her partner. I mean, that's very dramatic. I'm sorry, but I'm just saying that it's very, very complicated. It's not marriage therapy.
Right. No. Any thoughts or comments related to Ellen's points? Specifically, I mean, I think the comment you made about other municipalities where they've tried a mental health model in that particular example of where somebody was on the scene. Do we take anything from that? Where does that lead folks? It's an interesting point. That was sort of despite the fact that they had mental health services, this was still the outcome.
I'm just going to add, people call 911 when they can't handle a situation. And sometimes they can't handle a situation because they have a racist feeling about someone who happens to be in their neighborhood. And sometimes they can't handle a situation because there's a family mental health crisis. And the biggie is weapons. I mean, we would all feel more secure handling interpersonal anger and difficult situations if we didn't, if guns were only for hunting. There are just too many guns. I mean, don't you think that what we're basically doing is calling someone to the scene of a really difficult situation who, when it really comes down to it, has the capacity that we don't have to counter that situation?
Yeah, that is a factor. Lindsay, are you
No,
I'm in?
no, I'm just, taking in what Ellen's saying, and I hear you, and I just think that there's a continuum. So when people have a weapon, that is on one end of the continuum where, yeah, there's too many guns, and we're asking our law enforcement people to walk into those dangerous situations. That's their job, and that's um, where we recognize that the service and the sacrifice that they are making or the risk they're putting themselves at. But there's also a lot of situations where there are not weapons. And so, um, or just, I've heard from talking to officers here in town that, like, when you get a mental health call, then you'll end up getting a call to that same house like 5 days in a row because that person's off their meds or whatever. And there doesn't seem to be resources because of lack of funding for, like, our officers to be able to call and say, can you follow up with this, mental health organization? There is, so they kind of just know, like, okay, I'm going to be going there for the next 5 days. So um I just, like, since we're envisioning, I would like social workers and other types of people in our community to be given as, like, it's kind of like when you have a community, you have police. That's like, you have a fire department, you have police. It's like fait accompli. Like, that's part of, I would like to see, like, you also have human services workers, like, as part of the city. Like, that's like, you have to have that to have a city, just like you have to have a fire department or police department. But if you could have one thing, I think, and I got this idea also from talking to someone in law enforcement, a woman in law enforcement. She said, if we had social workers and other people working with, not separate, not like we're collaboration with this organization, but working within our force, that would do a lot for the culture of policing that can become problematic in terms of the very male toxic masculinity culture that can happen in policing. I just watched the Independent Lens documentary Women in Blue. I have very good female friends in the police forces, and it's real. Working in a male dominated field, there is a culture of toxic masculinity. I'm not calling out Easthampton, just in general. And just imagine if, like, there was different types of skill sets and different types of people all working in the same building, collaborating at the lunch table, talking about their cases together. Like, it would just kind of open things up. It would just, I feel like it would create a different kind of culture that's not so us and them, and bring in other perspectives. Like, if we're just imagining and being creative, like, I would like to see a community safety force that included law enforcement people, and also, without question, also included human services people and other whatever kind of people we think we would need. And if we look at our data and we look at the kind of calls we get, like, what kind of people do we need to make our community, Easthampton, feel safe? And I'd be interested how many houses they get called to where there is a weapon in Easthampton. So that's
Tom.
So at some point, if people who aren't city councilors start talking, I'm just gonna step back. But for the time being, this just some interesting prompts. So, um, I yeah, I'm all about, like, I just think that in general, like, and this has nothing to do with all the police officers I've met in Easthampton have been, upstanding people who I think do their best to do a good job. I think that in general, as a country, we don't really have as much sort of social work or mental health or public health in general infrastructure. I think that during the pandemic, we've certainly seen this when it comes to, like, just diseases, right? Like, just we have really expanded our public health department, and I think that we're not alone there. So I think that in general, there's a look of, like, there's some other employees that are involved. I think there's other things that are potentially cases where maybe you do need a police officer involved, but there's potentially situations where you might have less of that kind of incident if you did some things differently. I'll bring up an example. So I'm a precinct counselor, as is Counselor Gomez. So I get a lot of neighborhood issues, neighborhood complaint type things. And one of the number one things that I actually hear about as a counselor is speeding and unsafe driving and traffic things and drunk driving and all of that. And that is at the point where I think, like, if you are driving unsafely, somebody needs to stop you from driving unsafely before you kill somebody, which has happened in my precinct during my tenure as a city councilor. But I also think that there's currently a lot of thought being given. I'm using this as an example. You could find, I'm sure, tons of other examples. There's a lot of thought being given to how we engineer our streets. I live on Holyoke Street. It's a race course. It's a very wide, straight, flat street that I, as someone who deeply cares about this community, sometimes catch myself speeding on because it's just easy to not notice how fast you're going. Lindsay, your neighborhood, I mean, and particularly, like right around the corner from me, Clark Street is, again, it's remarkably straight and flat. There's very few trees. There's very few obstructions. If you wanted to put a street where you felt very comfortable going very fast, we have a lot of those, right? And so this is a case where, like, I don't dispute at all that if somebody is driving drunk, if they're speeding, if they're driving recklessly, they are putting people in danger. We need police to go in and stop those people and disincentivize them from doing that in the future. But I really do think that there's like street improvements, that we can do that would potentially make more people understand how fast they're going, to make people feel unsafe driving at unsafe speeds. And that sort of thing could potentially just mean that there's less of those sorts of incidents. And that's important because I think any of the city councilors can vouch. If you actually go to the police department and ask them for increased policing on this street or that street, what you'll get is that, like, they're like, yeah, it's kind of a problem everywhere. We've got a certain number of guys on the road at any given time, and this is what we can do. So like there's an understanding that there's more demand for this. So maybe this is, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of rambling. I guess my point is, I think that, when we talk about policing and sort of the role it should play and what other things, I think one thing that people come up with a lot is this idea that, like, oh, well, there's certain times where there's literally just somebody in danger and you really need somebody who's going to be able to intervene potentially with force. And, like, I accept that, but I also think that maybe we can make sometimes some structural adjustments that actually sort of change the way that people interact with each other and with the spaces that they're in. So maybe there's less of those sorts of incidents to begin with.
Thank you, Tom. That wasn't rambling. I actually love it because it is in line with, what we're trying to do tonight. And that is maybe take a step back and to connect it with what Lindsay said, think of ways that don't rely on criminalization or punitive responses and invest resources to prevent or to be proactive. And so I think that's an excellent example. And I was kind of wondering if folks had any thoughts about the ways we could do that, not just with traffic, but even to some of the kinds of issues that you mentioned, Ellen, prior to something coming to a head or to a crisis, or the example you mentioned, Lindsay, around regular calls to the same address, could there be some kind of group that's comprised of the folks you mentioned who proactively problem solve specific issues, and whether that is traffic or somebody in the midst of a mental health issue that's taking place over several days, if there was a way to get the right folks together to problem solve around those issues, and to be more preventive. Can we do that, not just with Tom's example, which is a great one around traffic? Are there other types of areas, that we could use this approach to be more proactive and problem solve and lessen the use of criminal penalties or punitive responses, which we know, end up doing harm to folks in numerous ways potentially, without, you know, actually fundamentally solving the issue. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, a question which I hope maybe the mayor's group can just investigate. To my knowledge, there is a 24/7 crisis response mental health contract. I mean, the state pays for that. And from Googling how that works and listening and reading, you know, there was a letter to the editor in the Gazette by a retired Northampton policewoman who kind of confirmed this, which is between 8 o'clock and sometime in the morning, that crisis response will not come to the scene, which means an Easthampton police officer cannot call that person to the family's home. They have to bring someone from Easthampton to the emergency room where the mental health counselor will meet them there. So I think it would be good to investigate why that is so, because my belief is that you can call a crisis mental health assistance during the daytime. I mean, it's a state contract. It's the way they planned it out. And I'm assuming the reason is money or safety or something like that, but it exists. I'm not saying that it's going to be, Lindsay was talking about how you get help for the same address that they're responding to 5 days in a row. That's really different than crisis response. And I'm sure there are real inadequacies there, but it would be good to ask, you know, why the mental health crisis response is the way it is. I mean, I would start by asking the police what they have available to them at 11 o'clock at night. Really specifically. I've been in the emergency room at Cooley Dickinson Hospital where I've watched police walk in someone who was in exactly that situation, who had to be convinced to be willing to go to the emergency room and really didn't want to be, and was clearly having a mental health crisis. And was welcomed by first name by the nurse who was familiar with her. You know, it was, I don't think this is a good thing for police to have to do.
So in a moment of crisis, are you saying it could be different if that option existed 24/7?
Well, it does exist 24/7, but it won't come to your home.
I mean, right. So I mean, really exists. So if they're not coming to your home, then it's, you know, is that, yeah.
Well, and how real is it? I mean, it's some on-call person who the person in need has never met, who hopefully is skilled enough to talk them down or help them in some way.
So even then, I guess what I'm hearing, I'm just going to try to say what I've heard. If we want the police to sort of not have that as their main responsibility to respond in those moments, then we need sort of the 24/7 crisis. And we hope that those people are also trained and able to, or is there another way? Is there a different route that, you know, we're not talking about, but folks might know of, or a different way to think about responding to those kinds of crises? As you said, Ellen, it's tough.
Yeah. Well, in my vision world again, those people, like, because Ellen said someone coming in they don't know, those people would be in our local community safety force. They would work integrated with our law enforcement folks, and they would probably, since it's a Easthampton family and we're not that big of a town, they'd see the address, you know, they'd come in and they'd be like, oh, we should probably go to this together. And there would be someone that they knew. And that's kind of a really nice thing about living in a small town. If we could have most of our people working locally, that would be good. I just think is when you can have more skill sets working together, that's different kinds of people, different kinds of professional backgrounds, different perspectives. Um, that could be really great.
You raise an interesting challenge, which is that Easthampton is a relatively small community and relies on a lot of regional services, as Ellen has been pointing out. And so, you know, what would it look like to have that capacity in town so people would be known and be able to engage with people who understand their particular circumstance? That's a sort of outstanding question. I think the size is a question mark. It's both great because you generally know folks, but you know, is there a capacity? What's the capacity for shifting some of this in the ways that you were just describing? Any other thoughts? Or yeah, Ellen.
Well, I have another thought, which is partly because this Newton fatality that I read about in a couple of newspaper articles, you know, the guy that got killed lived in an apartment above the store owner who called the police. So obviously he knew him. And it's raised a question with me that I guess I'd like to live in a community, I'll make this specific, where the police would, on a regular basis, let's say every month, every quarter, pull together a community meeting where they talked through probably, I guess it would have to be redacted and anonymous and general in some ways because it would be confidential, but calls they got that they didn't need to get, calls that people might have had the skills to deal with themselves, and that they might train people in how they might talk to each other when they know each other. And, you know, how they might not bother with the police. Because, you know, you can handle these things interpersonally. I mean, I can think if I were to go through times I called the police, and that's what you would do. You would have a community meeting where you would say times I called the police and what I could have done instead of calling the police.
Where and in what, this is a great and interesting point. Where would these meetings happen and in what, how would they be organized? So by precinct, I mean, I'm assuming like all of Easthampton, that might be too big. So on what scale, if we envisioned kind of regular meetings with particular communities or neighborhoods, what structure would that look like?
I'm new. Thomas and Homer know that because I don't even know the spaces. I come from Amherst and we really, really didn't have a space in every precinct or community where you could meet. Big deficit.
Ellen, I love what you were saying because I went on a ride along with a police sergeant, and one of the homes we went to was upstairs, downstairs, and it was the neighbor calling on the neighbor, and he had said that they've gotten calls from that house before because, like, just as you're saying, the neighbor doesn't want to talk to the neighbor. And it reminded me, and my son in kindergarten, the teacher taught them like language for when they're unhappy with something, they have to ask them in she taught him skills to ask for them to stop. And if they still didn't stop, then they should tell the teacher. So just thinking through that, but you're right. I mean, some people they call because they don't want to just talk to their downstairs neighbor. Or I've heard too that we have a lot of calls in Easthampton about people having trouble managing their young children, and they'll, like you said, they have a situation they can't handle, so 911.
Which is, part of why this group and, these conversations exist, is we then introduce that into the equation when we might try to subvert or divert that kind of response. Yeah. What resources can we offer to the parent who, I mean, that what exists in Easthampton now? What needs to exist? You know, this goes back to our questions in the chat. So, you know, how do people get what they need in that moment? How would a parent in that moment that's not necessarily a crisis that is, you know, potentially violent, but is just really difficult? How would a parent get what they need in that situation without calling the police? And I think we probably all agree that, yeah, that we don't really want that to be the 911. What would a parent need in that moment? And does Easthampton have that capacity or those resources? This is probably for Tom or Lindsay or Omar, I don't know. But we don't have to answer it, but I think these are the questions that this group, you know, is hoping to really think more deeply about. And to hear, you know, for those of you who might be watching this, to hear. So if you have an answer to that question and you're watching this, right? What kinds of resources would Easthampton need? How could we invest those resources for that particular example? Parents who really are, and I'm thinking of the moment that we're in, families are under a great deal of strain and pressure and stress. And, you know, we often may not have a vision for alternative ways of dealing with that kind of conflict. And the police, you know, 911 is quick and easy. What can we do differently? So this is my plea to folks who might be watching or listening. Please, you know, get in touch with us. Do you have an idea about what that might look like? I'll go back to our questions and see if there's any last kind of final comments. So in this sort of ideal community, we've been talking a bit about some of these. How do people respond to harm? I think we've sort of talked about some of that. You have just, you know, discussed whether police are a part of that response, and maybe times and places when we might try to come up with ways to prevent having to use the police. Tom's example of, you know, what are we doing with our roads? How can we re-envision, you know, getting people to slow down in a different way? These are all great points that we want to take with us as we move this work forward. Any other thoughts around these questions or a different question? Since we're a small group. Yeah, Ellen, yes.
Yeah, I appear to be the civilian here. I came here to ask a question which is more about current policing as a new resident. So the teenagers in my life don't live in Easthampton, but they do live in abutting communities. And I've been talking to them a lot about racism, and they have lots of opinions. And the story they related to me is being pulled over by a patrol car and being asked, where are you going? My teenagers have white skin. They've never been pulled over by a patrol car unless they were walking with their friends who are young men of color. So I know that the police in that community are teaching them that white skin is protective, and that you shouldn't be comfortable in your own community if you don't have white skin. Now I'm new here, and I really need to know that that doesn't happen in Easthampton. So I know I could call Chief Alberti and he would say, no, it doesn't happen in Easthampton. And I'm even trying to envision, you know, where it would happen, Nonotuck Park, I don't know, that the police are watching young people. I'm aware from working with the DA's office that, you know, police do watch young people because they're watching where they suddenly start changing their habits. I mean, it's part of community safety. I kind of understand that. But it's not transparent. I mean, what does a patrol officer do every day driving around Easthampton? And if they stop and ask someone a question, does that go into a database somewhere? Or do they just get to stop and ask questions of anyone they feel like? I mean, I can think of lots of reasons why police want to engage young people, including that they just want to have a relationship with them. But I know that it makes my teenager is very angry about this and has learned a lot about racism from the police. And I don't know whether that happens in Easthampton or not.
Thank you for that question, Ellen. Part of the charge of the mayor's work group is to review current police data. And so that is going to be a part of our final report. And I can just say, while we won't probably have all of the data, we will have some data on traffic stops and citations by race and ethnicity. And it sounds like one of the things you're asking, which I can go back and sort of see whether or not this is one of the data elements, is age. So, you know, we know that we have to look intersectionally at these encounters and then about the ways in which police engage with members of the community. And so age, you know, gender, race and ethnicity. Obviously, you know, often police data is limited by how it is collected and input into the system. And that's a challenge that we usually face when looking at administrative data. But we're going to include some of that in our final report.
But my specific question is, and I'm expecting the answer is no, because I can't imagine they do it. Do police officers document every stopping and saying hello and questioning that they do during their shifts? I can't imagine that they do. It would be too cumbersome. But if they don't, how would we know?
We'll certainly ask about specifically stop and question. Is that what you're, I mean, just to be totally
Yeah, when I
clear.
was a teenager, they called it rousting. You know, you rousted the kids.
Yeah. By the way, I'm reading an excellent book right now. Just if I can recommend it, because it's about this. I happen to have it right here. It's The Condemnation of Blackness, and it's about the use of data, race and policing and crime. It's excellent. It's sort of about really related to the question you just asked and posed. How do we know if it's not counted? And obviously, you know, policing, a lot of it is about discretion, and sometimes that involves when and where to report things, you know, depending on what it is. So I will ask, or we will ask. Yeah, Lindsay.
In the mayor's pledge, are you looking at the union contract?
No,
Okay,
that's sort of outside the scope of this work.
thank you.
Yeah, Tom.
I would just say that as we get towards the part of this work that does a lot of data stuff, I would volunteer my services if at all helpful. I am an economist by training, and I'm a data analyst professionally when I'm not on the council. And I think that for me, one of the most frustrating aspects of this whole thing, as somebody who's had a fairly positive experience with the Easthampton police so far, but B, is also aware that, you know, I am not the sort of people who police tend to have bad experiences with police. So my experience there is only worth so much. And that I want to be a part of this conversation. I'm sure that any institution, certainly any government, local government institution anywhere in America has some things they could improve on. So I'm certainly want to be part of this conversation. And the lack of data that I can really look at and see and try and pull like findings out that are sort of measurable, it makes it, I find these conversations, and actually, Ellen, I love the question you asked, because it feels so much like a question since, you know, the George Floyd murder this summer. A situation that I've run into so many times is people saying, well, does this sort of stuff go on in Easthampton? And all that I can truly say is, beyond that, like, I have a pretty good relationship with the police chief, and I don't think he's the sort of person that would, but you know, like, beyond that, all I can really say is like, well, I've never heard about it, right? Like, I hear a lot of things about people who are annoyed at various city departments, or who think that that the city did treated them unfairly. I get all sorts of complaints about that, and I've never received this sort of complaint, but would I? I just don't know. Like, and so I'm just stuck in this position where I can say, like, I'm not aware of anything like that. But I often, the retort I hear is like, well, how do you know? And so I feel like the more data we have, the more that we can actually talk transparently about what is going on, and how, you know, how our police department is actually interacting with the public. I think we can maybe have some sort of more productive conversations than when we're just sort of speculating about what the police may or may not be getting up to. And if there
Right.
are issues in administrative data, you know, then I would just sort of propose that maybe that's something that we can have a broader conversation about. What's a mandate, like a state or federal mandate that we can't really touch, or what are things that we could do differently so that constituents and, you know, community members have a better sense of what's actually going on, you know. And so I don't know, that's the sort of thing that personally excites me, because I think, well, it's something that I have something productive to contribute. I guess that's most of it, maybe.
Do, do, does the mayor's task force have the clearance to look at, you know, the town database, not the stuff that are arrests, you know, that goes into the state database, but most police departments have individual databases about their calls, right?
Yes, so these are great questions. And Tom, since you said it publicly, I'll I'll hold you to the offer to assist. And in terms of data, what Desiree mentioned in the chat is Desiree said, I believe interactions are posted online. As far as we know, what's posted online is generally just a call log. And what I think Tom and what you're referring to are much larger data sets in aggregate that we can look at sort of trends over time and not necessarily a specific arrest. And so we're interested in looking at a whole host of data, whether that's use of force, whether that's traffic stops, whether that's citations, what you mentioned, sort of stop and question. There are incident reports that are generated usually from any kind of police interaction. And so, you know, that's all located in a big system that we have some access to because we've requested certain things, but some of it is about extracting it, I think, and the capacity for the department. I don't want to say too much because I'm waiting to sort of hash this out in writing in the report, but you know, these are, you know, Tom is an economist and a data analyst, and kind of like the issue of the police officer responding to a complicated mental health call, most police officers are not trained data analysts. And so I think that is another kind of question mark. But we have requested some data, and maybe there's more data that we need to be asking for. But I take Tom's point to also be that, where does this data live? How does it get reported? I'm wondering, are there community meetings that can be used to discuss, policing activities using the existing administrative data, which would allow for a much deeper, nuanced discussions of what policing actually looks like in Easthampton, aside from anecdote, right?
I mean, my picture, and I'm not sure about this, is most police, a 911 call, the dispatcher can call up how many times the police have gone to that address and tell the patrol car arriving at the scene. And that's separate from whether there were any arrests made. And you could probably say that, at a community level, what proportion of police calls happen in precinct 2? And so if it's a lot, then maybe precinct 2 should meet and talk about that and figure out what's going on. There's fairly specific data, which is all designed to be helpful to an arriving police officer. And I just don't know what clearance you have, because it's actually very private data and you have to have some clearance to get it.
So we're not interested in, at this point, for the purposes of this group, looking at specific calls, right? We would be looking at more aggregate data. But what you're describing is, how can all of the data and the information that they collect be used to do some of the problem solving and diversion that we've been discussing this evening?
Right.
And, Desiree writes in the chat, I'm not sure how it works, but I know we can request public records from the town. Is that the same for the police, or is there a privacy block for the people involved? It depends on what level you're extracting that data and information. I think there are privacy concerns for specific types of data that identify individuals, certainly minors, who might be involved in the kinds of calls that Ellen and Lindsay were describing. But I would sort of step back and say that there are ways of making this data more accessible. And there's a particular initiative called the Police Data Initiative. In fact, Northampton, the police department is a part of that. And they post all of their use of force publicly, including, a whole host of variables on their website. So anybody that wants to see, how many uses of force were reported, this year, can easily access that. There are other smaller departments like Easthampton that are a part of that police data initiative. And so, I think there's two things. How can data be useful to us? What is the capacity for analyzing that data and making use of it? And then how does data, or the use of police data, how does that help towards accountability and transparency? And, what is sort of the experience in Easthampton right now? It sounds like that's what you're asking. It's multi-pronged. Did I get that right to some degree? So, what are we collecting? How could it be used in the ways that we've been talking about tonight? And then, is it accessible? And how does it get actually? How do we understand what policing looks like aside from sort of anecdote, which is often, or narrative, or a news story? So I think these are great questions, and they're certainly part of what we've been doing over the last few months. So thank you for that question. Any other comments? This is all going to be really a part of where we go from here. So if you have a comment, for those of you who are watching, again, Omar has posted the links. And so, you know, if this has stirred something and you have a question, please find a way to reach out to us. We've put the links to the email address, the survey, and, you know, we again extend an invitation to meet with us privately and not in a sort of public forum, because we want to hear from those voices that may not feel comfortable in a public listening session. Lindsay, any last comment? Tom,
Saying thank you.
Ellen,
Mhm.
Desiree, Lauren? Well, this has been, though we had just few of you join us this evening, it's been incredibly helpful. I welcome the comments of any of my pledge group members. If anyone would like to just sort of say a few things, if you have any comment. Omar, Margaret, anything you'd like to add? Okay. It's been very helpful, and I think it is, these questions, you know, we'll get a copy of this recording. This will be part of the roadmap towards, you know, where we move with this work, and we're very thankful and appreciative of your comments and the exercise in envisioning a different way of doing things, which can be hard. So we thank you for that. The pledge page is on the city website, and we are going to be holding additional community meetings once we have a final report. And we're hopeful that those of you who have joined us this evening will participate when that time comes. And we just thank you and wish you health and safety, and reach out. You know where to reach us. Thank you all.